Thanks for tuning in to the Football Talk Squadron. I'm Dutch.
I'm Maul.
And I'm Pops.
And welcome to our college football episode. So we're going to be doing a little bit of more of a recap this week because we've had some time off where we didn't get to a lot of different games. We missed out on Texas throwing stuff on the field because Pops was angry that Georgia was smacking them. We've missed just some bigger games that have happened in the past few weeks and sort of some chaos. Last time we had a good rant about just sort of the ranking process, which leads me right into some trivia for the rankings this week. You all ready?
Send it.
All right. So there's a common opponent. So one of the things they talk about is that when a team has common opponents, that those are used to rank other teams. So the common opponents, UCLA, one team beat them 34-13, another beat them 27-11, and another beat them 42-13. The team with the largest margin of victory is ranked last of these teams. Then you have another example. These are two other.
Do they all have the same record?
No. Or actually, yes, they are all undefeated. Do you know the three teams who played UCLA?
One of them's Oregon.
You're correct. Oregon won 34-13.
Indiana
is the largest margin of victory, 42-13.
And Penn State.
Penn State, yeah.
Penn State 27-11. So you have that as one subsect of three teams. So you have Penn State that's number 3 in the nation, Oregon's number 1, Indiana sitting at number 13 right now. But they all played a common opponent. That's what's got them so far. Now, yes, Oregon and Penn State both have ranked wins, which helps push them a little bit higher into the category. Then I'll give you a hint. One of these teams is Indiana. See if you guess the other one. Indiana beats Nebraska 56-7. The next team beat Nebraska 21-17.
Ohio State.
Ohio State.
Yeah.
Now, the difference is Ohio State has a loss. I don't know if y'all saw this. Y'all ready for how this can go crazy and Oregon can be left out of the Big Ten championship? So Indiana plays Ohio State, and so does Penn State. There is a chance that if Penn State runs the table and Indiana runs the table, that they will have a common opponent, and that common opponent is that yes. One of the things is if you're all tied, and so Indiana never has to play Penn State. If you're tied in record, what it will go off of is it will go off common margin of victory for common opponents. Oregon only beat Ohio State by 1. So if Indiana and Penn State both beat Ohio State and they do it by more than 1 point, then those two teams, even with Oregon ranked as the number 1 team in the nation, would go to the Big Ten championship ahead of Oregon because of the margin of victory.
Penn State doesn't play, or Oregon doesn't play Penn State or Indiana?
Mm-mm. Indiana's remaining schedule is Michigan State, Michigan, Ohio State, and Purdue.
I think the one thing, I do like this hypothetical, or not even hypothetical, just the situation you're developing here. But going to the Horseshoe in Ann Arbor for Indiana, man, it's going to be tough. Like, I know Cignetti has turned that program around, but, dude, having to win at Ann Arbor.
So they're not only going to take that one common opponent, though. They're going to have multiple common opponents, right?
But it's the highest ranked common opponent.
That's all it says is the highest ranked common opponent.
It's one of the factors.
At the time of playing them or at the end of the season?
That's a great question.
Because if Ohio State loses to Penn State and Indiana,
they're still getting into the playoff in that case.
Well, they will, but they're probably not going to be the highest ranked common opponent, I guess, at that point.
I don't know who will be at that point because when you look at the rest of the AC or the Big Ten, I don't know who else is going to be up there. A lot of that's going to be settled this week. This is where I don't know if y'all heard Kiffin side rant. Kiffin was throwing a fit, which I agree with him on. He was like, it makes me mad that the SEC gave LSU now 2 night games. They got a night game against Ole Miss, and now they're getting that night game against Alabama. Next week, Ole Miss has to play Georgia. Not a night game. It will be in the fourth quarter, but it's a 3:30 kickoff. And he's like, guys, like, why are y'all not giving us, the night game? And I look at this week, Penn State goes and plays Ohio State, and Ohio State comes to Penn State. What do you think's harder, playing them at noon or playing them for a whiteout at night? Like,
Exactly.
This is where it's a conspiracy theory, but it's like, I really do think that they're like, we don't want to damage Ohio State anymore. Let them, they're still having to go, but don't give them the even tougher challenge of doing it at night.
This was my biggest criticism from the get-go about, like, I get it. We got all these super conferences and stuff now, but it's like they botched the ability to get a true conference championship because they didn't schedule the schedules evenly across the board or had all these teams even play each other. Like, what's the point of everybody being in the same conference now if you don't even play everybody in said conference? You know what I mean? Like, that defeats the whole purpose and allows these random, like, oh, you could be the number 1 team of the nation but get left out of your own conference as an undefeated team because we didn't schedule the right teams appropriately. Like, and that goes back to my original thought of, like, how do you fix this college football debacle that we're in with these rankings? Is, like, sorry for the SWACs and the MACs and the Conference USAs, but, like, the SEC is not playing you anymore. You know what I mean? Like, SEC needs to play SEC. That way there's no, like, outside bias or these ways to, like, say, oh, well, I lost to this team, but I have a better win. Like, it doesn't matter because you play everybody in your own conference, and then whoever comes out of that conference is the winner. And we will meet you in the college playoffs to see who's better, the SEC or the Conference USA. You know what I mean? Like, that's the only way to fix it because that's what the NFL does. Because without that, and this solves our debate of, like, the AP poll, right? Because now you can have whatever ranking system you want as far as, like, who we think is better and blah, 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 all that stuff. But it doesn't matter at the end of the day. It can be a moral victory of, like, well, yeah, we finished 3rd in our conference, but we're still the 4th best team in the nation. Copy, see you next year because you're not making the playoffs still. You know what I mean? And, like, that's how the NFL does it, right? Like, I don't care how good you think you are or how good you were last year, which somehow should carry over into this year. But, like, at the end of the day, if you don't win your own conference, you don't get in. And maybe that prevents these, like, super conferences from just building, right? Because if Texas is like, well, shoot, now I got to try to survive the SEC, as if I could just go back to the Big 12, which makes the most sense, and mop up those dudes every year and make the playoffs, let's do that. You know what I mean? Like, that helps some of this craziness that we got going on, and maybe we can get back to the regions of, like, how college football was meant to be.
So that's the other thing. A guy went down a rabbit hole. There's these conference championship, like, where you can sort of pick, like, hey, these are the things that happen. A lot of it hangs on Saturday's game of Bama LSU. If LSU beats Bama and then runs the table, it will come down to Texas and Texas A&M. What's nuts is that if Texas beats A&M, Texas A&M still goes to the SEC championship and they'll play LSU again. So you'd have Texas and Georgia both left out of it because LSU would be, have one loss to A&M. A&M's only loss would be to Texas, but Texas has got a loss to Georgia, and there's this weird path because then LSU beat Bama, Texas A&M beat LSU, that it goes back to leaving out Georgia and Texas, which, to your point, and this is I love your idea. The issue is that when the ACC has 17 teams, when the Big Ten has 18, when the SEC has 16, you can't play everyone. And it ruins, like, someone's going to get a bye. Like, someone's getting a pass.
You can't play everyone right now, but, like, if we went back to sanity as far as, like, geographically located conferences, you wouldn't have 17 and 18 teams in a conference. You know what I mean? Like, you can just literally, and I said this before, like, take a map of the United States and just draw 12 circles around the United States that makes sense. Everybody that falls in that circle is now in that conference. You can call them whatever you want to call them, right? As far as like Pacific or Southwest or whatever it is. But like, that would even out the, you know, what teams are where, and you just play those teams, right? 12 teams, you get 12 conferences, or, you know, whatever, 11 teams in 12 conferences. That equals pretty close to the amount of teams that we have. And then you've got a good mix of bad teams and good teams in each conference. And if you survive your conference and win, you get to go to the playoffs, period, dot. And then, you know, we can go off the rankings from there as far as how the seeding happens, right? And it's like everybody's going to be trying to still get that number one seat because you want to play whoever's coming out of the SWAC every year. You know what I mean? Like, but when you got 18 teams in a conference and 4 of them are out of conference games, well, what's the point of even being in that conference? Like, you didn't change anything. It's just so people could say like, oh yeah, we're in the SEC. It just means more.
Speaking of that, get your guys' take on this, because this was the big thing from the top 25 that is driving me insane. So I understand Oregon being number one. They have the best win against Ohio State in terms of the matrix of who has won and you're undefeated. They beat the number, I believe, either number 2 or number 3 team at the time in the land, and they dropped the number 1. Then you have Georgia at number 2. And you would sit back and go, okay, who's number 3? Penn State. And you go, okay, that's a little weird. You have an undefeated team in Penn State that has some ranked wins being behind a 1-loss Georgia. It's like, okay, well, if you tell me that, then the number 4 team in my mind would go Texas. They have 1 loss. That's to Georgia. That's it. This is where it goes off the rail for me. It's Ohio State. Mm-hmm. And that's what I don't understand. It's like, if we're having ranked wins, Texas, I get Michigan's not good, but when they played them, they were a top 10 team. Like, Texas went up there and beat them. Texas has also beat Oklahoma, who was ranked at the time. Like, but Texas is all the way down at 6. Like, they're behind Ohio State and Miami. Miami's undefeated. And it's like, so I don't get it. Like, why is Miami, like, you had no problem bumping Georgia above Penn State, and you had no problem putting Ohio State ahead of Miami. I don't understand. My issue with Georgia is this. Is Georgia a good football team? Absolutely. Their loss looks worse now to Bama. Bama got beat by Vandy and Tennessee. Even if Bama ran the table, they're not making the SEC championship. So at best, Bama is just hoping for an at-large in to they need other people to lose for Bama to get in. So I just sort of look at the ratings and I'm just like, this is why for me the AP poll's trash. Like,
they pick and choose when they want to use, like, you know, oh, well, we lost to the number 1 team in the nation. No, you didn't. They weren't the number 1 team in the nation when you lost to them. You know what I mean? If anything, you were the favorite of the game. You should have won. Mm-hmm. So you know what I mean? Like, this is why, again, like, the rankings don't mean anything. Like, they do in terms of, like, when you want to look back at it and justify how you're going to rank them. But like the committee and how these get settled out all are just off of, like, well, what we think. You know what I mean? Like,
that's the problem with the committee is they take these top 25 wins into account. Like, you hear it, Heather Dinich gets on, she's like, well, they have 3 top 25 wins. And like, I look at Notre Dame, for instance. Beginning of the season, they beat number 20 Texas A&M. That win looks a lot better now than it did at the beginning. But then they beat number 15 Louisville and number 24 Navy, both of which are no longer ranked. Like, Louisville and Navy are both out. So the idea that Navy, the very first week they hop into the top 25, which this is like goes to that conspiracy theory that I say, it's that they give teams a bump because of who they play next. That way Notre Dame gets another ranked win, because Notre Dame doesn't play in a conference. Notre Dame needs as many of these as possible.
that was my biggest thing with like LSU. It was like they lost to USC at the beginning of the season, and at the time it's like, oh well, they were a ranked team and they were really good, but USC loses a couple games, quickly gets bounced, which I'm not defending that, like they should have gotten bounced, but based on the logic that they use, how did they keep bumping LSU up in the rankings? It's like, well, now you've got a loss to an unranked team. Like they pick and choose when it matters on what the ranking was when you played them or what the ranking is at the end of the season, right? Like they pick and choose whatever fits whatever narrative they're trying to go that season. Like Florida State is a perfect example. Beating the number 10 team in the nation means nothing now for Georgia Tech. Nothing now, because Florida State ended up being terrible. So why is that so significant? Well, because you ranked a team that had no business being ranked there. You know what I mean? Like you have to play, I don't know the magic number, but you have to play a certain amount of games against certain levels of opponents for anybody to get a legitimate read on you and go, all right, this is who I think is the best team. Because remember at the beginning of the year, like Oregon was playing awfully. They were terrible. Now they have since played a much better, line of football and deserve the number one spot. But the only reason we're saying they deserve the number one spot is because they started out higher ranked and then haven't lost yet, right? But like if we just started with a clean slate and Oregon was playing the level of football Oregon was playing, there may be like 15 or above at that point, right? Now, at this point in the season, I think we can all go, yeah, I think they're a better team than this team. But like, again, it doesn't matter what we think because we all thought Alabama was a better team than Vandy. You know what I mean? We all thought USC.
Wrong.
Yeah, we all thought USC was a better team than Minnesota and Maryland. Like, it doesn't matter what we think. All it matters is whether you win or lose. So like, this is why I just have such a big problem with these rankings.
Pops, you haven't said anything. Are you still
No.
mad about throwing bottles on the field?
No,
Trying to
man.
get-
I mean, I can't say it any better. I'm sitting back and I mean, it just like you said, it makes absolute no sense. The decisions that they're making. Yeah, we'll get into the games because you guys have said it all already.
The only other thing that I want to go back, just because we're talking about the bottles on the field, is you talked about it, Pops, when we were talking about it on the phone, or maybe it was me and Maul. So that whole incident happens. They overturn the call, which all of us were sitting there texting like, I cannot believe that they just did this.
Yeah, exactly.
And then last week, there was a targeting call against Ohio State. And when they were like, no, it's a targeting call, what did the Ohio State fans do? They threw trash on the field. And it was like, dude, that was like, Big Ten was on the phone, like, do not show this. Like, we cannot have this type of like spotlight. And they didn't even talk about it. But it was like, no, this is exactly, Kirby Smart said it great. He's like, you have set a precedent that if you don't like something, throw stuff on the field and see if you can get it overturned. Like, the crowd wins.
Somebody made a phone call into Ryan Day's like, hey, go bump into the ref so we can show that because we got nothing else.
Dude, I don't know if it was you who I was talking to, but the ref in that game, like the behind the scenes ref that they pay, had a great comment on that. He was like, yo, Ohio State just got away with a big thing. Like, this whole sideline warning is only when, like, during the play, like in the white,
yeah,
not on the field of play. Like, they're out on the field of play. That flag should have been an additional 15, which who knows how it changes the game then for Nebraska. Now, they got a first down either way, and then Nebraska just absolutely pissed it away with throwing a pick. But from the standpoint of how that changes momentum, dude, another 15 yards, you're on the other side of the 50. Like, it changes the play calling. Everything changes from that one call. Ohio State, and this is why we said Ohio State was the number one hated fan base in our eyes, is because they always get the breaks. They always get the benefit of the doubt, which I will sit back and tell you the SEC does too. How Missouri is ranked the number 25 team in the nation, crazy. Like, if anything, they should have left Vandy at number 25. They
Exactly.
played Texas tough. I get Vandy lost to Mizzou on a last-second field goal in overtime that their kicker missed, but the idea that if they played the day that Vandy wouldn't beat Missouri is
You're wrong.
criminal. Yeah.
This is what I'm talking about. Like at this point, USC got bounced, right? Again, and I
Yeah.
say rightfully so. Right, I'm not defending that. I'm saying rightfully so. At this point, USC got bounced. Why does Missouri not get bounced? Like, what's the difference? Like,
And to give credit to USC, they at least led up until the second half. Mizzou got stomped by A&M and 34-0 by Bama. Like, there is no redeeming part to any of those games. They should have been bounced, but that's what drives me nuts. It drives me insane.
If I can, just for one counterpoint, again, I think we all know what line, what side of the line in the sand I stand on. But, and this is where it becomes very difficult, is there is at some point a line in the sand where you can go, I don't really care what that team's record is. They're not playing the same level of football as everybody else. And I'll just bring up Army, right? Like Army is ranked 21st, but they're 7-0. Why are there a bunch of teams above them that are ranked? And I think everybody probably agrees, like, that's probably where Army should be, right? Does anybody have like real heartburn with where they're at? No. Right? Again, right? You're like, that's probably, they got one right. And it's like, well, why? Like, why do you have this undefeated team that we just talked about all up at the top? Like, how is there, why are these undefeated teams not above the teams with the loss? But then we get all the way down to Army and we're like, yeah, that's cool where they're at. So again, like just from the counterpoint, so if people that are listening to this don't get all, they're only taking one side. I'm just playing the devil's advocate here. At some point, yes, there is a line in the sand where you're watching games, and I think that is the key there. Asterisk, double mark that, highlight that. Watching the games and seeing the level of play that these teams are putting out on the field week in and week out and going, that's good football, but not as good as maybe this other level of football. The conference you play in has nothing to do with that. Let me just highlight that as well. I don't care what conference you're in. If you're playing good football, you're playing good football. Like, I don't want to play Boise State right now. You know what I mean? Like, good luck trying to tackle Ashton Genty. You know what I mean? So it doesn't matter the conference, but that's the problem, is these rankings are just filled with bias per the conference. And they're not balancing the watching the games and going off of level of football versus like what matchups we think are going to sell the most tickets.
And I based on what we're saying here with where everybody is, the one example that I would say is at the highest right now that I've kind of got an issue with just based on the way that they've been playing is Miami. Like they just have not been playing that good of football. They've been beatable every single week. And so then you look at it, you're like, all right, who are their opponents? They just recently came off the win against Florida State, but Louisville almost got the chance to beat them. Louisville used to be ranked. They're not ranked anymore. It was a one-score game there. And then you're like, well, time out. There's another undefeated team that's in the Big Ten or that's in the top 10 that, has been beating everybody as well, and that's BYU. Why is Notre Dame ahead of BYU and even Tennessee? And so it's just like, make it make sense. Like, does playing in the Big 12 make that much of a difference right now? Because I tell you, I probably wouldn't put them up against, the SEC, but I think the BYU could hold their own in the Big 10 right now, just on the way they're playing football.
And
it's great that you bring up
outside the way I was going to say, the only way that you solve that is by playing in your conference and surviving your conference, because at the end of the day, like, do the rankings matter or do the wins matter? Like, sadly, it feels like the rankings matter first,
unfortunately.
Right? Like, yeah, and like that's not how the sport is played, right? Like, I just go back to the NFL. I don't care what you think the ranking is, but like Miami is a perfect example. Minnesota a few years ago, the Vikings I'm talking about, they were playing terrible football, but somehow we're squeaking away with like 8 straight one-score game wins. And you know what? They're going to make the playoffs because they got the win, right? So like, yeah, it might not be pretty and the ranking, they wouldn't be ranked high, but it doesn't matter because they're still winning the games. You know what I mean? And I think Dutch brought this up, is like in the NFL, every team, regardless of how bad they are, even the Carolina Panthers, like it's still an NFL team, right? And they're being given the credit of you are an NFL team. So every win and loss matters. In college, though, it doesn't, right? Like every college team does not get credit for like you are a good college team or even a bad college. Like it's just like it's a huge dichotomy or bell curve of like the worst team in college versus the best team in college, where like that bell curve is so much tighter in the NFL. And I think that's like where the big problem lies.
The other big, for me, this is where I can sum it up, is you're correct. Not all college teams are viewed the same as pros. We're not all equal. So we sit back and how do we justify rankings? Top 25 wins, even though that occurred in the past. What I don't like, and this is something that the NCAA, like it refuses to be talked about, is categorizing losses. Like Clemson loses to who? Georgia. Shouldn't have gotten and got ran out of the Mercedes-Benz Dome here in Atlanta. Notre Dame loses at home
to NIU.
To a 28.5 underdog in NIU. And they lose at home, but they're ranked higher than Clemson. Now, I also go back to Pop's thing with Miami. Miami's undefeated in ACC play. They have played 0 ranked opponents, but here they are sitting, what is it, number 6 in the nation right now? Number 5. Then, if you go all the way down, almost to the bottom of the top 25, I believe at 18, I'm pulling it up, 18, you have Pitt.
Yeah.
Pitt has played no ranked teams, but they played ACC opponents, and they're undefeated, but they're 18. And it's like, well, so why is Miami up here and Pitt's all the way down here? Now, what's nuts is that how will they handle Pitt? Because if Pitt beats SMU this week and then in 3 weeks beats Clemson, Pitt's going to somehow have to go from 18 in the nation all the way up to the top 5. Like, over in 3.
It won't happen. And it won't happen. Bet.
Yeah.
I promise you it wouldn't happen.
Yeah. And that's what I want to see. Like, do they put them ahead of Miami then? Like,
well, and that's my thing is I would bet they wouldn't even put it above Miami if Miami continues to win.
Because you know what's going to happen is they're going to beat SMU. SMU gets bounced out of the top 25. They're going to then look at it and go, well, SMU's not ranked anymore, so that win doesn't mean that much. What? Tell me I'm wrong. I mean,
I know you're not wrong.
That's exactly what they do.
And that's what it's what drives me nuts. Now, we've ran a little bit. We'll get into some of the games. Genty, he's got a chance. He's based upon where he's at in the season, he's 100 yards behind Barry Sanders' record right now in terms of where Barry was in the same season of the rushing title, which is nuts because Barry had 2,600 rushing yards in a season, which
Genty's also sat out like half of his games because he's done by halftime because he's putting up 1,000 yards a game.
They play San Diego State tomorrow night, which will be a good game. Boise's minus 23.5. Then on Saturday, the big game kicking off, Penn State, Ohio State. I'll just ask you guys the plain and simple question. Can James Franklin finally win the big game when it matters?
No. No shot.
I mean, is Drew Aller healthy? I mean, that's. I feel like that's going to be the biggest thing. If he's not, then absolutely not.
I just look at it as like, I don't want to give Ohio State a lot of credit, but like they played pretty good football against Oregon. Penn State should have lost to USC, and USC is not a good football team. Like,
that's true.
I mean, they had to use trick plays and all this kinds of stuff, win in overtime to beat USC, and USC ain't holding water against Ohio State right now. So, and I know like A plus B doesn't equal C all the time, but like Penn State is not a super powerhouse football team right now. They're just getting the benefit of the doubt like they always do, that they haven't played anybody good up until this point.
The piece for me that bothers me is exactly what you said to lead off the show, is talking about how Penn State doesn't get the whiteout game this weekend. Because you look at it, the only high-ranking game we get is Pitt and SMU. Like, don't get me wrong, it's going to be a good matchup. SMU's got a great offense. We'll get to that in a second. But, like, you're already giving the advantage to Ohio State by going in there, and also Drew Aller, is questionable. I haven't seen anything, haven't found it yet about how he's going to play. So Ohio State obviously is already at the advantage. And like Maul said, I mean, Penn State's their wins haven't been that impressive.
Yeah, it's frustrating from the standpoint of at the beginning of the season, we all sat back and were like, ooh, Penn State looks good. But especially the USC victory, as shallow as it was, really highlighted that Penn State started off in this tremendous high. And if anything, they've been slowly having this constant state regression. Yes, they've been winning. I'm not trying to take anything away from Penn State. It's just going into this game. I think that even if you ask the most diehard Penn State fan right now, like, hey, you got to bet your house on it. He's going to be like, yeah, and give me Ohio State. Like, it's just one of those. Penn State doesn't have playmakers on the outside. That's been Penn State's biggest issue. Penn State usually has a defense, but from a threat, like, name the last Penn State guy to come out offensive-wise outside of Saquon from the wide receiver position and especially the quarterback position. They haven't had it. And quarterback, man, I can't even think of a wide receiver that I'm like, whoa, that dude.
I was gonna say that Hamler guy, but he's not really made a huge impact in the NFL. He was just, I remember at Penn State, the dude was just unguardable because he was so fast.
I'd say Allen Robinson before he left the Bears. Yeah, he had 2 good years with him.
And that's the problem. It's like you look at Ohio State now, their guys haven't done as prolific. They've had, Chris Olave really hasn't done a lot with the Saints. You had Michael Thomas there for a period of time. You've got Garrett Wilson with the Jets. They've had guys come out that have had some flashes in the pan. Now, deep history, Chris Carter. But in terms of, you look at the Urban Meyer to where we're at right now, I would argue that in terms of both sides, Ohio State, you look at Jeremiah Smith, that's the biggest issue I see for Penn State is do I think that they can hold Ohio State to less than 28? Yeah. Do I think that they can score more than 28? No. That's my problem with Penn State. Then we got another big game is this one. It's just because of where it's at. Oregon goes to Michigan. Oregon right now is 14.5. It's one of these common opponent things that I sit back and I go, hey, this should matter. At the end of the day, Texas went into Michigan, beat them pretty handedly. I know that was our big thing with USC is even if they had won, it was going to be a super close game as compared to Texas. Michigan doesn't have a quarterback. Do y'all see any type of road blocks for Oregon going into Michigan?
I mean, honestly, no. I mean, they just recently had their backup quarterback say that he's done. So if Warren gets hurt, I mean, they essentially have no other options outside of Warren besides putting in a kid that's never played before. And looking at Warren's stats, he's got twice as many interceptions as he does touchdowns. Their only offense is running the ball, and their top running back hasn't even broken 700 yards yet. So Michigan is – it goes to show just how great of a coach Harbaugh was at building a program because in 1 year they're already absolutely dog crap.
Do y'all give any chance that for the largest cocktail party in the South that Florida somehow shocks Georgia?
No.
Easy enough.
I mean, it might be closer than what people are thinking, especially since, Florida had, they played Tennessee really well, beat Kentucky pretty handedly. I think they're finally kind of just, again, not like really anything spectacular, but like hitting a stride where like they don't look like the absolute dog water that they were at the beginning of the season. And every Georgia fan will tell you that like it's like Florida and Georgia Tech. Those are like the two teams for Georgia that you just can never, doesn't matter how bad they are in any given season, like just you gotta show up and play because that something crazy could happen. This is one of those like Beck could be the make or break, right? Like if Beck shows up and just keeps turning the ball over like just every other possession, I mean, Florida might hang around longer than a lot of Georgia fans are going to be comfortable with, but that's really the only way that they get close.
This to me is the what I'd like to call the upset of the week. If I had to pick a game that I think is going to be upset, it's Texas A&M going into Columbia, South Carolina at night against South Carolina. Texas A&M's offense, yes, with Reed, looked completely different than Wegman, which was me and Maul were dying laughing about, because during that game, after he got benched, you did not see my man on camera for the rest of the night. Like, I
Nope.
don't know where he went and where he hid, but they did not show that poor dude on the sideline.
I've just been seeing all these memes about he's just waiting for baseball season to start.
But South Carolina has a very good defensive line. They have disruptors across all fronts. That's sort of my bigger issue with A&M is their offense at times has looked downright anemic. If South Carolina, this gives me the shades of when Tennessee went in there undefeated and then Spencer Rattler just lit them up. Now they don't have that type of offense out of South Carolina, but the environment going in there, it will be rowdy.
Well,
because there's nothing else to do to Columbia, South Carolina.
And Vegas is already calling it too. I mean, they've only got a 2.5 for Texas A&M on the road after a big win. And, South Carolina almost beat LSU, at the beginning of the season. It was a one-score game, a field goal game. Kind of in the same boat. They Bama barely squeaked by as well. And I mean, we understand like Bama struggled this year too, but South Carolina's competitive, in these games. And I mean, I don't disagree. I could see A&M losing this, maybe the, new quarterback just doesn't show up for whatever reason. Maybe he gets the yips on the road.
Is Reed starting or is Wegman starting? Do we know?
I don't know, but I would tell you that if they start Connor Wegman again, that they'll fire their coach, because there's no way.
That's the biggest factor for me, honestly. And this is setting up for all aspects of like the classic trap game. This will be, I think, Elko's first real good test as far as like he's a defensive mind. I think defensive oriented teams are less inclined for trap games, because if they can just show up and shut down the other team, like that's their strength, and that helps prevent the upset, but if you're like Ole Miss, this happens to all the time, because Ole Miss loves to just play offense. If their offense struggles at any point, they're getting points scored on them, and that's how you get upset. Whereas like defensive oriented teams, even if you're not playing great, like you can still prevent the other team from scoring, and that obviously that's how you win the game. So this will be Elko's first test, basically, I think, of like trying to not fall into that trap, and we'll see if he's up to the test. I don't think they're going to get upset, but I mean, I guess we'll see what happens.
Speaking of traps, been leading up to this mid-season review time, since we're halfway through this episode.
Whoa.
We'll see where we had some big swings and misses.
Florida
State. Yeah. Huge. I got one win. Luckily for me, I had the ACC championship as Miami versus Clemson, with Miami winning. That's still a possibility. Maul, you had Florida State going against Miami with Florida State winning. Pops, you had Florida State going against Clemson with Florida State winning. It's easy to call now, but there's no possible chance that that's going to happen. So
Absolutely.
Correct.
Definitely the big swing and the miss on Florida State. Now, all of us Big Ten-wise still said Oregon, Ohio State, which after the first 3 weeks of the season, I think all of us were like, that Oregon pick was bad, but now we're sitting back and we're like, oh, no, Oregon's looking pretty good. Maybe so. Now, my question for you is, me and Pops picked Oregon, so Maul, do you still feel comfortable going with Ohio State if they meet again in the Big Ten championship?
Yes, and even more so now, because we all talked about this during that episode of like how difficult it is to win both those games. Like it's almost beneficial to lose that game with it, as long as you have that guarantee of I know I'm going to meet them again, right? Like Ohio State's still got some work to do, right? They've been put on notice. And like if Indiana continues doing what they're doing, right, they might not even get the second chance. So if it falls down to that, where Oregon and Ohio State do match up, then yeah, I'm even more so confident. Just because, again, of all the things that happened during that game that allowed Oregon to win. It's not like they ran away with it. You know what I mean? Like they're changing rules now because of what happened in that game. So
Now to a conference that we all swung a mess on everything. I had Utah versus UCF. Maul, you had Utah versus Oklahoma State, and so did Pops. It's what would you call the bigger disappointment, Utah or Florida State this year?
Oh, Florida State, hands down. And that's not to say that like Utah's not super disappointed, but like Florida State's doing things that haven't happened in like 80 years bad. Like, and a lot of Utah's problems has just been because Cam Rising can't stay on the field. So like
Exactly.
they're disappointed, sure, but like they at least have some mild excuse of like why they're not getting it done. Whereas Florida State is just like, well, we gotta we need a new
Utah's
team.
still 500. Like, and I know that's not impressive, but even without their star player, they're still at least doing something, unlike Florida State.
The Big 12's been the most surprising conference this year, which is you look at BYU, Iowa State.
BYU?
It's those two teams. BYU right now has a chance to really get, in my opinion, a top 4 seed, because if they win out and go undefeated, this is where it gets interesting. Is like, do you put a 1-loss SEC team ahead of undefeated BYU? Like, how does those ratings get played out?
This is where, though, I'll just kind of go back to those rankings, and it's a thing that I hate. BYU's
preseason
only shot at this point is stay undefeated, right?
Mm-hmm.
The committee is going to just be like, sitting there just licking their lips every single game, because the instant BYU loses, gone, right?
Well,
like,
if they win the
gone.
conference championship for the Big 12, they'll get in.
Sure. But like what I'm saying is like the committee, the instant BYU loses, it does not matter to the committee that they were 8-0 at
Correct.
one point, right? Like
they'll
it
get
doesn't
dropped
matter
10
if they're
spots.
not exactly. That's what I'm talking about. Like the instant BYU uses, boom, right to the bottom of the pack, right? But like Bama's over here with 2 losses. Sorry, I keep bringing up Bama. This is just
They lost to Vandy, Tennessee. You ain't hurting me. I've been hurt already.
But that's what I'm saying. Like you can lose 2 games, one to an unranked opponent at the time, and still be in the top 15. But like for a fact, BYU could lose to like I don't know what their schedule's like, but like
their next game is Utah next weekend.
They could lose to somebody even decent, another ranked team, and boom, right to the bottom of the pack because it's BYU and not Alabama.
And so that's the unfortunate part. Looking at BYU's schedule, they have not played a single ranked opponent this season. So that could have a lot to do with the reason why, they're sitting below Notre Dame. But, like the argument we had earlier in the show, make sense, because they're still undefeated. Iowa State's in the same boat, 3 spots later at number 11. They're still sitting undefeated. And truly their biggest test is going to be Kansas State at the last game of the season. Both teams are still ranked.
So that's not true. BYU beat SMU. SMU wasn't ranked at the time, but look at them now.
True.
And this is like the problem is we only have this like look back. Well, it's like, well, they were good at the time, and we don't look back and say
Kansas State was 13th at the time. Like,
how are you not going to give them a top 25 win when now the team's top 25?
They beat Arizona. Arizona has turned out to like not be a good team of after all, but like they weren't ranked at the time either, but like they were in and out of the rankings. Like they beat Oklahoma State. Like they've beat these teams. This is why like you get down this rabbit hole of like, oh well, BYU hasn't played anybody. I'm sorry, like we're talking about these top 25 matchups of teams that BYU has already beaten. Why do they automatically get bounced when they lose that first game?
Mm-hmm.
Correct. SEC, I had Georgia versus Texas. Maul, you had Georgia versus Bama. Pops, you had Georgia versus Texas. We all had Georgia winning. It's a debate right now, just based upon how the season plays out, if Georgia will even make the SEC championship going forward. My question to you guys is knowing what you know right now, who would you pick to win the national championship? A little mid-season prediction that will be written down.
Well, I'll be honest. It's not going to be the team that I chose, as much as I hate to say it. What? No, we all picked Georgia, right?
We did all pick Georgia to win.
Man,
I had Georgia playing Ohio State. Maul had Georgia playing Texas, and then Pops, you had Georgia playing Oregon.
I mean, based on the way they played Texas at home, man, it's hard to go against Georgia still, even this day. Like, I think they're going to win out because, I mean, Ole Miss on the road is their next big challenge. But they play Tennessee at home, and then they get essentially two bye weeks with Massachusetts and Georgia Tech. I'm going to stick with the Bulldogs. I don't trust Texas. You know, they got manhandled on that offensive line, and they did absolutely nothing to change. You can't do that against those big teams, and I could see A&M being able to do that here at the end of the season, and we end up with a 2-loss Texas team. I mean, they barely escaped Vandy. And then Oregon, they're beatable, in my opinion. I know Dan Lanning, is a product of this coaching tree, but I mean, the defense just giving up, 30-plus points to Ohio State. They just don't have it yet. So for me, I'm going to go with the Bulldogs.
If there was another team with really super dominant quarterback play outside of like Miami, Cam Ward's playing out of his mind and he looks great, but like a whole of a team, they're obviously beatable. If there was another team out there though that was like playing really good football and had a good dominant quarterback, I could see picking them. But I'm with Pops. Like, yes, they looked atrocious playing Bama in that first half, and they've absolutely regressed from the few years prior as far as like the Georgia team that we're used to, but they're still a really good football team, and they showed that against Texas. And they're those kinds of teams that's like, yeah, Bama got lucky. They really did. Bama got lucky and beat them. Georgia's one of those teams though, like Bama and Ohio State have kind of been in the past of like, you may get lucky once, but like if you think you're going to come out and get lucky multiple times in a season against a caliber team like that, like this is why like Bama and Ohio State have so many championships like in the last few years. And it's not that they're not playing good football, but it's like some of the biases in the rankings put them in when they maybe should not have gotten in. And then it's like, oh, well, they ended up winning the national championship, so we're justified. Well, it's like, well, no, you're going to give a team like that of that caliber multiple chances. Of course they're going to come out on top. You know what I mean? Like, who's ever played golf? Your second shot is always better than your first shot. You're second team All-American. You know what I mean? So it's like you give a team like that multiple opportunities, which especially in the 12-team playoff, especially since there's not really any other super dominant teams right now, I got to stay with Georgia.
Your point is spot on in terms of quarterback play, because I look at it from two different things, one of which I don't see in college football this year. First being that you have to have a quarterback that's like an NFL talent. CJ Stroud, he almost beat him. Bryce Young, I know it hasn't worked out, but he's still the number 1 overall pick. You have to have a dude that can just literally pinhole it. There's not that guy in college football. The second guy, which I do think is capable of beating Georgia, is your running quarterback. Is you have to have a threat to run and get outside of that rush of Georgia. If you can have a guy that gets past that first wave, Georgia doesn't have the linebackers. Don't get me wrong, they're still very, very good linebackers, but they're not the linebackers that we saw under their 2 national championships back to back in terms of play. The only team that I sit back right now that I look at and I go, I wouldn't be surprised with a young quarterback if they couldn't pull it off, is A&M. Because the other side to the Georgia thing is it's not just the quarterback play on their side of the ball. It's how does Carson Beck lose it for Georgia? Because if he
Yes.
throws it like he did against Bama in that first half, playing a good team, they will get down again 28-0.
That's a
Like
great.
that,
That's a great pick. Great point.
Well,
that's how it happened.
A good
And I mean,
running
you-
quarterback and a solid defense. Like that's literally the only team that fits that. Really is Tech or
It's
sorry,
A&M.
A&M.
and that's the
And that's
thing,
why
like,
Georgia or Texas struggled.
Yeah, and you look back at the Texas game as well, using it as the reference. Georgia only scored a field goal in the second half. You know, like Texas was able to make the things they needed to do, the adjustments on defense. I mean, the offense still looks shaky, but you know, they show that they're beatable because once you take away Carson Beck's first read, he's like Tua. Once you take away his first read, he doesn't know where to go with the ball.
And Beck tried to lose it for him. You know,
Yeah.
it was the correct call that it was a Texas interception. That's not the problem I had with it. It was the fact that they huddled, declared it was pass interference on the defense, and then
Yes.
after all the trash got thrown on the field, then they came back again after somehow meeting again.
Yes.
Oh, this was the conversation that mattered, and now we're going to give it back to Texas, which it should have been. But Texas had every opportunity to win that game. Beck
Yes, they
is the worst quarterback that that they're going to talk about for first round picks next year. In terms of that dude cannot look off that first guy. Like I think you said it was either my dad or Pop said, or maybe it was you, Maul. They were like, "Who's going to draft him?" And someone was like, "The Browns," and you're just like, "Yep, that fits." That's a textbook pick for them. Like, and everyone's gonna be like, "What happened?" And it's like we saw it in college. Like, he is on. This is where it drives. It's sort of like the Anthony Richardson argument.
I was going to
but-
say, I was just about to bring him up.
Yeah, here's Anthony Richardson at least played on a bad Florida team. So guys were like, well, it was the talent around him. Like Beck does not have that argument. He is on the best team in college football for the last few years. And you still just get out there. He looks like Timmy off of South Park. You know, just my man is struggling when it comes to defense. Timmy!
Well, and the thing about it is that gives a little bit of hope to all the SEC opponents is he hasn't been benched yet, you know, in all this bad play. So that just
He
tells
won't be
you
benched. They don't have anybody.
exactly they don't have anybody to replace him.
That was the only thing that sort of we never really talked about it, is they pull Ewers, give Manning in there, and it was like Sark was saying he just needs to like reset. That more blew my mind to like pull him out and put Manning, you know, in and not give Manning at least like a quarter or two to try to figure it out. It was like, no, we're going to give you a drive or two. That still nothing's working, back to yours. And it just, without that pick, honestly, it's even larger of a loss. The defense really kept them in the game because of how bad Beck played. I keep looking to Texas right now, and it gives me the shades of when Jalen played for Bama. It's like I think that everyone in the building knows that Manning has the most talent that in that quarterback room. It's about when do you finally commit to it? When are you going to pull the trigger? Because I thought we had saw it. Like I even sent you guys a text like, "Oh, we're going to see Manning at half," and I was like, "Oh, well." Turns out it was the second quarter, and then they didn't stick with him.
Yeah, Ewers has been a real surprise this year, and I don't know if it's like, you know, it's like those guys that are like backup running backs that look really good, and you're like, man, if that guy could just be a starter somewhere, and then he goes somewhere to be the starter, and then you're like, oh, he actually kind of sucks. Maybe that's why he was a backup. Like that's what it feels like.
Tony Pollard.
Yeah, it's like Ewers right now, and it's just like he's never been the dude in the spotlight of like he's gonna be the number one guy. But he always was like, dude, why is he not getting more looks? And then now it's like he's in that spotlight, and you're like, oh well, he's not really showing up. And I know the injury didn't help and all that, but like, yeah, he's been, I think, Texas's biggest letdown.
Well, and the fact was we pulled him from Ohio State, and you know how good Ohio State quarterbacks outside of C.J. Stroud, you know, have been year after year. So I definitely think it's been tough. And you know, he started out the season as the Heisman hopeful, you know, or one of the top guys up there. But look how fast they changed the narrative once Manning came out and had a couple good games. Now he's the Heisman favorite, and it's just like, obviously it doesn't matter from a how they play their talent wise. It's all about their wins and losses and the numbers that they're putting up. But it's like Ewers was putting up numbers against the blind and crippled, but yet in the games where it mattered, he's not doing absolutely anything. I mean, you guys saw me texting you guys with that Oklahoma game, and I was just like, he's terrible. Get him out. And like, I get it. He had timing issues because he sat out for a month. Like, completely got it. But then you have another, full week of practice to come out against Georgia, and you look like that. Like, it's just right out. And I think Sark is trying to save his draft stock. If not, like, Ewers is going to end up at a lower tier program and not make it to the league, or if he does, he's going to be a practice squad guy trying to fight for a spot. And I think that's what it boils down to.
Well, he's already sort of, in my opinion, working his way out of the first round just from the injury aspect. Giving a lot of shades of Colt McCoy with, if you can't stay healthy, it really doesn't matter how well you sling it. Yeah. Drink.
Well, and I think he reminds me a lot, too, of Sam Ehlinger, who was the starter before this guy. Like, he had moments of greatness, but in the big games, he just didn't show up. And then, they beat Georgia the one time in the Alamo Bowl, under Ehlinger, but he was never the guy that he was hyped up to be. Ehlinger had a terrible staff coaching him, but, here with Ewers, he's kind of without excuse.
Yeah. But it goes back to there's not a great quarterback play right now in college football.
Absolutely.
Period. Now, Genty's been playing out of his mind, but I think it speaks a lot that, a non-Power 5 school, a player is the front runner for the Heisman at the position of running back, which is hard to do. It's because there's no quarterback play that anyone's like, yeah, that's the guy. Like,
if there was any quarterback that was like playing even, a sliver of like what Jaden Daniels was or like Caleb Williams was, like it wouldn't. Yeah, Genty would be putting up all these numbers, and they'd be like, yeah, like he's good, but he'll just be second place. But
yeah, he's not throwing the ball too.
Yeah, exactly.
So, well, that was our college football episode. You guys got anything else before we sign off?
Yeah, who's going to win Pitt SMU? I mean, that's a pretty big matchup between smaller divisions, smaller conferences.
SMU is -7.5, but I like Pitt. I like Pitt because I think Pitt knows that if they can keep their quarterback play, Holston, he transferred out of Alabama. He's thrown 17 touchdowns, 5 interceptions so far. He's played really well. SMU, their biggest issue is SMU's inconsistent.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they'll have good. You look at their schedule now. Pitt's the same way. Pitt's beat Cal by I think 2 points, and Cal lost. That's the only team that Florida State's beat all year. So every single week for Pitt is sort of they've made it through the hurdles. If a team's going to beat Pitt, in my opinion, it's going to be in 3 weeks when they play Clemson. That's the game that they'll end up losing, but I think they end up beating SMU.
This one's tough just because I think SMU, at the surface, you think they have a better offense. And then you kind of look at the numbers and you're like, oh, Pitt's offense is pretty good. Well, maybe SMU's got a better defense. And you're like, oh, Pitt's defense is better than SMU's defense.
Well, I mean, just look at the Syracuse game. They picked off Kyle McCord. What was it? They had 3 pick sixes that game
in the first half.
Yeah,
terrible.
I'm with you, Dutch. SMU's kind of been a little inconsistent. If they allow Pitt any bit of window to stay in the game, like for the long shot, Pitt's probably going to come out on top. Who I think a better football team is, I still give SMU the nod. I don't think it's a 7.5 point favorite. I think it's closer than that. So from like a betting standpoint, you want to take the points, take Pitt. But if you made me bet on like an outcome winner, I still just think SMU is a better football team, so I would have to go there. However, I can easily see SMU showing up to one of those inconsistent games and Pitt taking advantage of it.
Yeah, and I mean for me, I would take SMU as well, same as you, Maul, where Pitt's going to get the points. But the thing for me, that was kind of that's kind of alarming. Excuse me for mixing up my words there. They barely beat Duke last week. I mean, they had to take them to overtime. But other than that, SMU's been running the table against everybody. The only loss that they've had all season was to BYU. And now we look at BYU and we're like, all right, there's this great team that we have here. And looking at Pitt, you're just like, well, copy. These guys are undefeated, but who have they played? And I mean, for me, being in Dallas, hey, you know what? Bring back the Pony Express, man.
It's criminal that SMU's in the ACC and not the Big 12.
I
what
agree.
Maul talks about with those circles that I like sit back and I'm like, every Texas school, it used to be that way. They used to play every Texas school. You played Baylor, you played A&M, you played Texas Tech, TCU. It was like, there's too many teams in Texas for us to have any type of debate about what team's the best one. And now they're just scattered to the wind. And we're just like, oh, we'll figure it out on the back end. Like, it just, yeah, it's frustrating.
We need to come up with like a slogan on a hat that says like "Make college football geographical again" or something like that. but
You'll be called a domestic college football terrorist.
Yeah, well, gosh, sometimes it makes me want to shoot myself.
Outside of that, you guys got anything else?
No, that's a good one.
All right. See you, boys.